talk will be about mathematics and feminism and AI fairness. And yes, I will also talk about fairness metrics. I know it's a topic many people don't want to talk about anymore, so it won't be the focus of my talk, but it will play a role because, yeah, of my background, and that's how it is. Yeah, so as you just said, this talk is mostly about my most recently published paper, which has this beautiful academic title, Towards Substantive Intersectional Algorithmic Fairness, Desiderata for a Feminist Approach. This paper was published in the journal AI and Ethics, and it was a joint work with Laila Wegner from TU Eindhoven and Jonas Strube and Carmelite Scholten from RWTH Aachen University. So in the first part of this pub talk, I'd like to present some insights, some selected insights and ideas from this paper. And then in the second part, I brought some discussion questions where I would love to hear from all of your rich experiences. To be clear on that, the target group of this paper is mostly technical AI practitioners. So I don't know how many of it will be really new for most of you, but I try to put it in a lot of perspective so that you hopefully can take home some interesting thoughts. If you have any questions for understanding, don't hesitate to ask them straight away during the talk. But yeah, we will also have some time to discuss in the end, and I'm looking forward to that. So I would like to start this talk actually with a personal story. So this is me, or more specifically, me in the year 2021, so 5 years ago. I had just completed my master's degree in mathematics at RWTH Aachen University. My focus really was on statistics, data science, machine learning, and I had learned in great detail how to extract statistical patterns from large databases. When I was reflecting then about what would come after my studies, which was in the middle of a global pandemic, I fell across the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, and I instantly started to question what the data that I had looked at for such a long time would actually be able to tell me. I guess many of you know the book. For those who don't know, Caroline Criado Perez illustrates powerfully how data could tell a whole different story of what it was initially supposed to be. And yeah, I started questioning the whole endeavor of extracting anything significant from data, which is quite a depressing thought when you just spend several years of your life trying to become better at this practice. So I was extremely glad that when I found my institute that I'm now affiliated with, which is called Gender and Diversity in Engineering. And this institute is actually a bridging professorship between the disciplines of philosophy and engineering. And it aims at connecting what I felt at that time were two complete distinct worlds. In an international context, it might seem sometimes ridiculous, but disciplinary engagement is so important for us in Germany. And having an institute that is at two faculties at the same time, and also at faculties that are so different, seemingly different from another, like philosophy and engineering, is still quite unique in Germany. And then I was even more happy when the professor offered me to pursue a PhD to dive into gendered realities in the world of data. So what followed, I'm going to spare you of that, were dozens of hours of trying to understand, to put my head on philosophical topics. I, of course, read about these fairness metrics that aim us to tell how a fair algorithm would look like, tons of papers that criticize these metrics. And my very first funding application that was rejected, I totally get why, was to try to reduce the distance between perceived fairness and what I called true fairness, whatever that was supposed to mean. Assuming I could measure these two variables and put an optimization algorithm to it to then get a final score. That was simply the language I had learned in all of my studies. At some point, I started engaging with feminist scholars and soon learned about the idea of intersectionality. And of course, I came across and read Kimberly Crenshaw's famous law critique from 1989 called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, the paper which is until today among the most cited, if not the most cited paper when it comes to the topic of intersectionality. When I read it, something interesting happened to me because while I was reading a law critique from 35 years ago, I felt like I was reading a critique of today's practice of evaluating fairness in algorithmic decision making systems. And I really did not understand how it's possible that there is such a rich scholarship and community organization on multiply marginalized experiences. And still, 35 years later, we are having the same or similar discourses over and over again. And this is somehow where my paper starts. um, and yeah, let me explain why and what I mean by this. So I am talking about the context of algorithmic decision making, meaning that algorithms are used to support certain decisions. These decisions then distribute certain social goods, for example, jobs, credits, or decide who should be investigated for fraud. So I'm talking about the context of these high stake decisions, mostly in the public sector. And I'm completely sure you're all well aware of these systems and also of the scandals that this practice has brought about. For example, just to name one, in the Netherlands, where tens of thousands of families have applied for childcare benefits and have been wrongly flagged for fraud, which is why they wrongly needed to pay back thousands of euros. So there have been many of these examples where this procedure has led to harms for certain groups because the outcomes have been disproportionately negative for some groups compared to others. And then what then happened, the technical world, there was a myriad of attempts to avoid these distinct outcomes for different groups, leading to the famous and infamous metrics that then tried to post hoc correct the algorithmic outputs in a way that seemed fair for the considered groups. These metrics usually look at and correct the final outcomes of this procedure. There are also other ways like adding more balanced data, adjusting the algorithm, and so on, but all of these have flaws at some point. And also, what is nice from a technical point of view, checking these outcomes, is that it allows practitioners and institutions to have numbers indicating to what extent the algorithm would be fair. I was once asked at a philosophy conference why technical people are always so obsessed with algorithmic fairness. And I personally, from being a technical person myself, think these numbers are what makes it so attractive. Anyway, there are different ways of calculating these metrics. You know that. I don't want to go into the details here now. What I would like to talk about um, is the point that most of these fairness metrics still today evaluate fairness, what they think is fairness, with respect to one single group, like, for example, for gender or for race. Sometimes they investigate many different groups like gender, race, age, social class, and so on, but then mostly distinct from another. What I just showed on the slides are excerpts from the IBM 360 toolkit, which is still largely recommended for using fairness metrics. But it is exactly this practice, this single axis thinking, what Crenshaw criticized the US legal system already 35 years ago, and what is reproduced in a similar manner in the context of algorithmic fairness today. The quotes on the slide are from Crenshaw's article, and they illustrate what I mean by I feel like the critique is so similar of these two systems. So the issue is that if we are talking about gender discrimination only, we usually implicitly mean people who are privileged in all other dimensions except gender, like white, heterosexual people, middle aged, maybe from a higher social class, and so on. But by doing this, we obscure the claims from people whose experiences cannot be traced back to discrimination from one of these dimensions alone. And again, having a look at the technical side of it, this neglecting of people's experiences and claims at the intersections, for example, of race and gender, is reproduced if algorithmic fairness metrics only evaluate these single axis metrics. So on the slide, it's a very constructed example to illustrate the point. There is an algorithm that produces 100% correct results for black male and for white female, but 0% correct results for black female and white male. A simple fairness evaluation, a single axis one, would only for gender would show that the error rates are 50% for both genders. Nice. And the same would hold for race. So we would not find these 0% rates for the subgroups. So it's not difficult in this constructed example to see that the results are highly distorted for the respective subgroups. On the technical side, this phenomenon is called fairness gerrymandering, an algorithm that seems to be fair for some groups, for example, for the upper groups, but unfair for some subgroups. And it was the study Gender Shades, also very famous, by Joy Bolamwini and Tim Gebru in 2018, which showed that facial recognition software asserted a much higher error rate for darker women. That also sparked a series of developments to consider these subgroups in the context of algorithmic fairness and these algorithmic decision systems. So there are some technical metrics to account for these subgroups also already for a long time, but there are also severe technical limitations. Like with every dimension that we add, there is an exponential increase in the amount of categories that needs to be considered. So which categories should we then choose for investigation? At some point, at an ever finer level of granularity, there simply would not be any relevant data. So what is often done if subgroups are evaluated, the subgroups for which statistically significant data exists are chosen for fairness evaluations. But then there's also this problem that in some scenarios we can create a fair algorithm for some subgroups, but then it becomes unfair for others. So what can be seen here, even if we would like to think that fairness metrics can solve justice problems, and of course they cannot, the issue of considering subgroups is technically a very difficult exercise. And it would also be quite easy to argue that this kind of intersectional fairness wouldn't even be possible at all, because if we continue to generate ever more subcategories, we eventually end up at the individual level. Anyway, what I stumbled upon, and now I'm done with the fairness metric part, was in all of these publications, the more or less consistent use of the word intersectional in this context. They all claim, or not all, but most of them claimed to interrogate intersectionality. And now one could argue, yeah, well, names are just smoke and mirrors, as we say in mathematics. The use of the term intersectional just means, yeah, the intersection of groups. But then there is this great paper by Ovale et al., who conducted a literature review on these technical intersectional metrics. And they found out that most of these papers actually did reference intersectionality literature. So it is to assume that they wanted to take the idea of intersectionality into account when they developed these subgroup metrics. But if that is the case, I'm wondering what then happened to the complex and rich discourse of intersectionality that is out there in the humanities? What happened to discussing intersectionality in the context of social justice, power, social context, etc.? For example, in the context of facial recognition, Is it their priority that there are less errors for Black women in recognizing their face, for example? In which context are these technologies used? Who has the power? And so on. Like all of these big questions. So, I am not the first person to raise this critique of intersectionality being collapsed into the notion of subgroup fairness. There has been some great papers by, for example, Ovalle, which I just referred to, by Hoffman, Kong, Hampton, Himmelreich, a lot of great papers who critique this practice, but they all critique it from slightly different angles. So the first part of my paper, still part of the background section, I reviewed all of this critique and I derived 6 main points of criticism that are all recurring in all of these critique papers. For example, the over-reliance on only the subgroups that are statistically significant without looking at those who are socially significant, that these categories are considered detached from power, or that disadvantage is centered and addressed instead of also talking about systemic privilege. And I gave this approach a name. I called it formal intersectional algorithmic fairness, which is a term that follows Ben Green's concept of formal algorithmic fairness, which he describes as fairness is seen as a fair contest where all individuals are evaluated by the same standard based only on their characteristics at the point of decision making. So, my next question then was not necessarily how these shortcomings could be overcome. If I would have an answer to that, I think I would either be the richest or the most hated person on earth. But I wanted to provide some orientation for AI practitioners that are willing to align their work and their practice more with intersectional ideals. Like, what could be aspects they could challenge in their own work? So, in other words, my goal was to enrich this narrow formal view in intersectional fairness with substantive ideas from intersectionality. And I termed these ideas substantive intersectional algorithmic fairness, again borrowing from Green's concept of substantive algorithmic fairness, which he loosely defines as tailored actions to address diverse needs, historical injustices, and systemic barriers. And to derive these recommendations, I combined the current shortcomings that I just sketched and a richer body of Black feminist literature on intersectionality. And what was the outcome? I ended up with 10 suggestions for action, which I called desiderata, structured into 4 areas. And the first area surprised me personally the most, since I had read a lot on overcoming the narrow focus on protected subgroups or considering power relations in the other papers who criticized this practice of reducing intersectionality to subgroup fairness. But I did not have the impression that epistemological assumptions were a thing, even if epistemology, I always have difficulties in pronouncing this word, in AI, of course, are a thing. But in the context of intersectionality, intersectional scholar Patricia Hill Collins, warns directly that work that claims to address intersectionality without interrogating its own epistemological assumptions risks reproducing the very social inequalities it aims to address. So, one of these aspects that I suggest is to be conceptually very precise in what is addressed in one's own work. And I know that sounds pretty self-evident, but it's not. So let's have a look at what happened when intersectionality became collapsed into subgroup fairness. My observation is that, first and foremost, intersectionality has traveled the disciplines. And in the first place, there's nothing wrong with that. Concepts, ideas travel between disciplines all the time, and they also change their meaning along the way. Sometimes concepts become even more powerful by this transition across the disciplines, more rich, more nuanced. Kola puts it into these beautiful words and compares this traveling across disciplines to us traveling. He says the point of arrival might be very different from the point of departure, but to make your fortune, you have to follow and also trust the process. So, in the context of intersectionality, there have been many travels through the disciplines. Even though Crenshaw, with her famous paper, is sometimes seen as the godmother of intersectionality, especially in academic discourse, since she was the person who gave it a name. Long time before that, people had gathered in social justice movements all over the world, addressing these compounded forms of discrimination and wrongful inequality, and they still do. So, when Crenshaw wrote her famous article in 1989, she found a powerful way of articulating what all of these initiatives around the world fought for. And by giving it a name, the term intersectionality found its way into academia. First, by her background, by law, but soon also and in great detail in the humanities. So, intersectionality became a framework for describing and diagnosing social inequalities. But this process of putting the fight for social justice into polished academic concepts was also not seen without skepticism. Some argued that by entering academia, the ideas of it needed to fit into a dominant epistemic norm, such as, for example, scholarly objectivity, and thus lost some of their political nature. So nowadays, intersectionality is often discussed in two strands. There is intersectionality as critical praxis, which is still exercised by communities that fight for social justice, but also the advantages of using the lens of intersectionality as analytical tool to diagnose and describe social injustices are nowadays somewhat uncontested. So, long story short, one can say intersectionality traveled the disciplines from local community organizing to law to the humanities, always changing its face while still being useful or even gaining a lot more power. So, one could also argue with the rise of AI systems, intersectionality just made another travel to the discipline of computer science and changed its meaning along the way. Where's the point in that? So, the point is that concepts risk losing essential aspects of their original meaning when this travel across the disciplines is not accompanied by critical voices or deliberation processes. This happens primarily when people assume they know a concept and then assume that their view of it is all encompassing and correct. And this is also just natural that when disciplines come together, for example, in interdisciplinary contexts or work environments, that every discipline brings their own discipline bound framework to the table. This means that people within that discipline inherently assume that everybody knows what can be an object of study, how to study this object, what are implicit definitions of key terms that do not need to be given or explained, and how to interpret certain results of such a process. So, if people come together to work interdisciplinarily, what often happens is that disciplinary meanings are treated as self evident. Concepts are not questioned, and own definitions are seen as universal. And this does not happen because people are selfish, stupid, or uneducated, as Mika writes, who came up with a theory behind this, but because their disciplinary training has never given them the opportunity or a reason to consider the possibility that a simple word that they deem self explanatory might mean something completely different for another person. So, the problem is that this disciplinary view prevents discussion in the first place because people simply don't see the need to discuss. So, what to do in this situation might again seem pretty obvious. Mika suggests that instead of assuming that certain terms and concepts are self evident because they are in one's own discipline, um, she suggests a concept based approach, which means let us actively define concepts in each and every interdisciplinary encounter. And this encounter might be personal in working groups or in the academic world. So she, for example, suggests to make inherent meanings more explicit, which again might seem obvious, but the challenge lies in identifying the things that seem self evident and thus need to be made explicit in the first place. And she also says, let us embrace this traveling through the disciplines to learn from another and to be open to let a certain context evolve through dialogue. Of course, this requires a certain reflexivity of the actors involved in this process. And also, the process might look very different in different situations. There is no one size fits all solution. So, yeah, this is the first suggestion that I derived, like be conceptually precise about the terms that we're talking about. And this arose from the observation that in the case of intersectionality, it's always not clear what is meant or what is addressed by it. The second aspect I would like to talk about now is that this needed reflexivity brings us to two other points, which is first to reflect on one's own positionality and to try to make it explicit. And second, to interrogate potentially assumed neutrality or objectivity in all of these decision processes. So let us have a look at neutrality in the technical sciences. The view that technical systems are neutral or objective is still fairly widespread in the technical sciences. And I brought here some quotes that I gathered from my engineering students after attending my seminar on responsible AI. So they wrote some reflection papers where they evaluated their learning gain and their main learnings. And this reflection was pretty open. So I only asked something like, what did you like? What did surprise you? What did you dislike? And actually, most of the people in the seminar wrote something like, it was fascinating to learn that machines, which I had previously assumed to be error free or rational, may make mistakes. Or something like, I had an image of AI as being perfect in most of its application. Or AI is just that, a machine. It was interesting to learn that it's not. And yeah, as said, these are just some quotes, but most of the students wrote something like that. If you're interested, you can find the detailed analysis of this in the publication you can see on the right. So yeah, and in algorithmic decision making, similarly, when institutions formulate their goal of using algorithmic decision making systems to decide on humans, an often cited hope is to make procedures more objective. And now we are back in the middle of being conceptually precise because it is rarely defined what is meant by objectivity or what is seen as objective. Instead, in most of the cases, at least from what I read, is that there is a common understanding of what objectivity is. And I found this great paper from Thule from 2022, who made different conceptions of objectivity explicit. So, usually explanations about something are considered good if they somehow accurately capture facts about our world. And usually, at least from what I can tell from the technical sciences, this accurately capturing facts about the world is meant in a sense that facts that are free of personal subjective opinion. So, the implicitly assumed idea here is that there is such a thing as the objective truth that we can gain knowledge upon. And further, that there are objective methods that enable us to acquire this knowledge. And one of these methods is also very famous, the view from nowhere. The view from nowhere describes that if a person is able to have this view from nowhere on something, then the person has objective knowledge on that thing. This can be imagined, for example, by the metaphor of a very tall mountain. Um, and if a person is standing on top of this mountain and the person has a 360-degree view on everything that is there, then this person has a view from nowhere on its surroundings. So it knows everything. So what this person knows is free from his or her personal subjective influence. So people who have reached the top of the mountain have this objective knowledge that is completely stripped from the personal, the political, the private, the partial. And Thule calls this view on objectivity aperspectival objectivity, so knowledge that is assumed to be free of perspective, free of any perspective. So, in other words, if we think that there is such an objective truth independent of us, then it is possible to acquire knowledge on it. And if someone arrives at the top of the hill, he or she acquires this view from nowhere. And I dare to claim that this is the goal of using machine learning for deciding on humans' lives. People aim to find this aperspectival objectivity, assuming that it's everyone's goal to find this aperspectival objectivity. But seeing this aperspectival objectivity about the benchmark, about what constitutes knowledge, also implicitly means that we accept that there are some people or machines that are able to reach this point of having a view that is completely stripped of their own perspective. And second, in turn, that claims that are subjective in nature do not constitute real knowledge. And feminist scholars argue that it's not at all possible to achieve such a view from nowhere because we're all embodied and our embodied perspective is always situated and therefore always laden with perspectives. There is simply not such a raw, unfiltered data that we can mechanically assess without our individual biases and values. So, actually, this view of objectivity leads to less knowledge than more because we're ignoring some perspectives, while the goal of finding an objective reality is to acquire more knowledge. So, here it becomes interesting because since it's not possible to achieve such a view from nowhere, the motivation to chase it must lay somewhere else. And Tula analyzes that objectivity plays an important role in stabilizing the knowledge of dominant groups because, as she argues, it's usually members of the dominant class who think that their knowledge is, because it is the dominant worldview, not situated or value laden. And this, in turn, provides the dominant class with the means to stigmatize perspectives that conflict with their own worldview. And they stigmatize it as that is opinion, that is bias, that is subjective, so it's not valid or whatever. So the fact that we are often unaware of what features, social or otherwise, are influencing our very own beliefs, together with the epistemic power of the socially powerful, leads, according to Tulit, to the fact that certain knowledge is seen as valuable and other knowledge, especially the one that relies on social or other contextual factors, is discounted as knowledge on reality. So, what now? Tula suggests to redefine the idea of objectivity. First, she says that instead of trying to erase all personal features from knowledge, we should try to look at ourselves, to try to identify what are the individual features that influence our very own actions. So she suggests to render the familiar alien, and this can be try to look at oneself from another perspective and try to see, okay, what would the outsider perspective see in myself? And then she says objectivity is a characteristic of communities, not of individual people. Like a single person is certainly not able to acquire objective knowledge because objective knowledge is only something that can be shaped by several perspectives. So only communities can acquire this knowledge. And then she suggests to see objectivity not as this aperspectical, like in the view from nowhere, where one person on top of the mountain knows everything, but instead as what she calls perspectival suppleness. So a view on this mountain that is enriched by very different perspectives. So she says knowledge is objective if it has survived the scrutiny, or it is likely to survive the scrutiny, of a number of different epistemic communities, since this rich knowledge then is more likely to capture facts that accurately describe the world. So, this would make objectivity not anymore a binary value, something that is objective, yes or no, but a spectrum, depending on how much something has survived the scrutiny of different communities. Knowledge is more or less objective. So, again, this analysis somehow comes down to include as many perspectives as possible. And again, this is a call for community engagement. And to put it into the words of Longino, for example, knowledge is produced collectively through the clashing and meshing of a variety of points of view. So, yeah, for adhering to intersectional ideals, to make the turn back to my paper, it would already be a good starting point to question the own assumed neutrality in decision processes and to make the own positionality, like the own viewpoint, explicit. Of course, this does not is sufficient to solve all the problems um, that come with different power perspectives in the society. But I think it would help in making a step um, towards being true to what intersectionality entails. So yeah, that's basically it for my talk today. I think it was long enough. I thought it would be more interesting to look into some aspects in more detail instead of rushing all over of these recommendations. But of course, I'm very happy for everybody who's interested in reading the full story. Before we open the discussion and questions, I would like to close with two advertisement blogs. The first one is not for me, but it's a paper for the great Stephen Wettman, who the authors of this paper also engage with the idea behind intersectionality and with the question of how we can enable NA practitioners of understanding this rich concept a bit better. And our two papers kind of developed at the same time. We noticed when the papers were published that we've been working on a similar topic all the time. So their paper follows a very strong calling in approach for AI practitioners. They conducted a workshop and several interviews with them because they felt that many practitioners felt attacked by harsh criticism that is sometimes raised on them. So they also had the goal of proposing concrete recommendations. Um, But yeah, they focused on aligning them with the practitioners themselves. My work was a bit more conceptual with the rich body of intersectional literature that is out there. So I think their work is very important, and I also recommend to have a look at that if you're interested in the topic. We're currently working on a follow-up that brings our two works together and that center civil society voices. Because these are the voices that should be placed center stage in intersectionality questions. Coming to civil society voices, in another project that we are right in the middle of, we aim to investigate the question what NGOs that work in the context of AI and social justice would need to make or participation truly meaningful, because we're so often talking about we need meaningful participation, not tokenistic participation. And there are also a lot of literature that says, okay, yeah, they need to have power and so on, but we are more interested in the psychological factors and feelings behind it. So we are asking, how do civil society organizations, or particularly NGOs, conceptualize meaningful participation in AI? And we have already conducted a workshop with participants from civil society organizations of all continents, but we are currently looking for interview partners. So if you are part of an NGO working on AI and social justice and you're interested to contribute, and then we would be extremely glad if you are open for an interview. So if you're interested, there is a QR code with a Google form, but you can also just send me an email address. Yeah, so end of the advertisement block. So now we have 50 minutes. I'm happy to take a question. And if you like, I would be interested in how you experience this interdisciplinarity, this interdisciplinary working in the context of AI fairness and ethics. Do you have an opinion on what if we reconceptualize objectivity not as completely neutral, stripping away from all perspectives, but as this reflexivity account? And thinking further, one could also think about rephrasing responsibility, not the responsibility to create an objective, aka neutral process, but the responsibility to create a reflexive process, so to invite many disciplines at the table. And how could such a reflexive approach look like? Yeah, many questions, but I'm interested in your view on that. Thank you very much.